This mountain fed an empire by eating the people beneath it, and the world called the result money. This happened because Spain did not just find silver in Bolivia. It found a way to turn mountains, mercury, and indigenous families into global currency. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura, where we explore Latin America's history, mysteries, true crime, and local legends, always whispering intrigue. Subscribe for fresh revelations every week, perfect for your next campfire debate. Imagine a mountain with a mouth, not a cave, not a tunnel, not a children's legend told to scare the stubborn ones into bed, but a real red mountain above Potosí, Bolivia, breathing cold dust into human lungs and sending silver coins across the world. Later memory would give it the name that still follows it like a curse, the mountain that eats men. And the question is simple, but it has teeth. How did one Andean mountain feed an empire while swallowing generations? Before the crowns, before the tax books, before the royal seals and the mule trains, the mountain was already there. Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, rose almost alone in the thin Andean air, red against the sky like an old wound refusing to close. To the people of the region, a mountain was never just dead stone. Mountains had breath, mountains had memory. Mountains could protect, punish, feed, or refuse. Cerro Rico was not born as a mine. It was forced to become one. The evidence left in the earth shows that silver working existed in the Potosí region long before Spanish officials learned to spell its name. Not on the devouring scale that came later, not with fleets and banks waiting across the ocean, but with local hands, local skill, and local meanings. That matters. Because the old colonial story likes to begin with discovery, as if the mountain had been sleeping in ignorance until Europe arrived. But Cerro Rico was not unknown. It was known differently. The old story says that even the Inca world approached the mountain with caution. In the memory preserved by later chroniclers of Potosí, people connected to Huayna Capac tried to open the mountain and heard a warning from within it. "Do not take the silver from this hill," the voice said, "because it is meant for other owners." Maybe that was prophecy. Maybe it was colonial storytelling dressing conquest as destiny. Maybe it was a sacred warning remembered after the disaster had already begun. Either way, notice this: the mountain speaks before the empire does. Then comes 1545 and the story changes temperature. An indigenous man remembered as Diego Hualpa becomes the hinge of the legend. Some versions say a nighttime fire exposed a shining vein. Some say an accident, a lost animal, a sudden gleam in the ashes. The popular tale loves miracles because conquest always prefers a miracle over a confession. The harder truth is quieter. Hualpa did not reveal an empty world. He carried knowledge across a line where knowledge could become property. Soon, Spanish claimants moved toward the mountain, and Juan de Villarroel appears in the paper trail. By April of 1545, Spanish claims were being registered. Some traditions mark April 1st as the founding moment of Potosí. Others cite April 21st as the date of the first formal mining claim. Either way, the same thing had happened. The mountain had crossed into ink, law, and empire. What had been earth, spirit, and local memory was now being translated into ownership. Once that secret moved, it did what secrets do in the hands of hungry men. It multiplied. Prospectors climbed, officials counted, merchants smelled profit, priests came with crosses, builders came with plans, lawyers came with arguments before the dust had even settled. And below that red cone, in a place where a city should barely have survived, Potosí began to rise. Cold, high, dry, hungry Potosí. A city summoned by silver, as if the mountain had dreamed it and then regretted the dream. Step back and look at the absurdity. Potosí had little food nearby, little fuel, little wood, little softness. Everything had to climb: maize, meat, coca, cloth, tools, salt, animals, mercury, timber, candles, wine, saints, chains, paperwork, and people. Yet within a single generation, the city swelled like something impossible. Around the time of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo's reorganization, it had roughly 120,000 inhabitants. Later observers counted around 145,000. At its height, many estimated it at near 160,000. Let that sit in the cold air. In the Andes above the clouds, a city the size of a European capital rose because the mountain bled money. But this was not a city fed by its own valley or sheltered by its own forests. It was an artificial giant, a mouth built under another mouth. Every loaf of bread, every mule load, every beam of wood, every sack of coca had to arrive from somewhere else. Potosí was not just a settlement, it was an appetite with streets. Now hold one silver coin in your mind, cold, bright, clean enough to lie, before it reaches a hand in Seville, before it crosses into Asia, before it pays a soldier or settles a debt, it begins as stone inside Cerro Rico. It must be broken, carried, crushed, washed, burned, stamped, taxed, hidden, stolen, shipped, and counted. That coin looks small because the suffering has been polished off its face, but it is not small. It is a compressed planet. At first, the mountain gave too easily, and that was the trap. Near the surface were rich oxidized ores, so generous that workers could break them, sort them, and smelt them in small Andean wind furnaces called guairas. Picture the slopes at night, dotted with little mouths of fire, each furnace catching the mountain wind and turning it into heat. The wind itself became a worker. The fire answered the mountain. Silver ran from stone with a speed that made men believe the miracle would never end. But wait, because this is where the mountain becomes a machine. The richest skin of the hill could not last forever. As the easy ores declined, the empire faced a familiar problem. There was still treasure underground, but it was locked inside more stubborn rock. So Viceroy Toledo arrived in the 1570s with the mind of an organizer and the soul of an accountant. He did not merely regulate mining. He reorganized a whole region around extraction. Cerro Rico would no longer be a rush. It would become a system. Toledo took an older Andean idea of rotational labor, the mita, and reshaped it into a colonial draft. Communities across a vast highland world were ordered to send workers to Potosí. Not just wanderers chasing wages, not just men choosing danger because the pay was good. Drafted people, accounted people. Communities counted like fields of grain. The mountain's labor force became a map of distant villages, each one tied by quota to a tunnel, a mill, a refinery, a road. The ledgers are colder than ghost stories. Luis Capoche, a mine owner writing in the 1580s, described more than 13,000 drafted indigenous workers gathered in the Potosí system, with over 4,000 sent directly into mines and mills in an ordinary allocation. And then comes the detail that should stop us at the door. Many were expected to arrive with their houses, children, and wives. The empire was not only moving labor, it was uprooting households and making families orbit the mountain's hunger. Walk with them for a moment, not as a statistic, as a road. Sand in the teeth, cold in the bones, children wrapped tight against the wind, elders watching fields disappear behind them, women carrying memory, food, tools, grief, and whatever could not be left behind. The road to Potosí was not just a route, it was a wound drawn across the highlands. Capoche wrote of tens of thousands moving with families, and the roads looked as though a whole kingdom were shifting. On paper, the forced workers were paid. On paper, there were rotations, protections, assigned tasks, and officials watching over order. Paper is very generous that way. In real life, wages could vanish into food prices, tools, debt, tribute, clothing, lodging, and the simple cost of surviving in a city built against survival. Some communities sent substitutes, some paid to avoid sending bodies, some fled, some hid from the census. The mita was labor, but it was also pressure, a tax paid in flesh or silver. And still, Potosí was more complicated than one chain. Some workers were drafted, some were hired, some moved through the city, negotiating danger with skill. There were mingas, wage workers whose freedom was always tangled with need. There were transport workers guiding llamas loaded with ore, salt, mercury, food, and firewood. There were women sorting ore, sieving fragments, processing material, keeping markets alive, and holding households together on the edge of collapse. The mountain consumed families, not only miners. Afro-descended, enslaved, and free workers also belonged to this silver world. They were especially visible in the royal mint, in skilled and semi-skilled urban labor, in service, in transport, and in the commercial circulation that kept the city alive. Potosí tied together two violent frontiers at once, Andean forced labor and Atlantic slavery. The silver coin did not care whose hand touched it, but history must care, because without those hands, the clean money of the empire was only a dream trapped in rock. Here's the part the coin does not show you. The mountain ate in many ways. It ate through cave-ins, floods, collapsing supports, crushing loads, and underground darkness. It ate through altitude, where every breath is thinner than a promise. It ate through cold that crawled into fingers and lungs. It ate through dust inhaled day after day until the body became a mine of its own. And after mercury entered the process, it ate invisibly through vapor, tremors, poisoning, and silence. You may have heard the famous number 8 million dead. It moves through popular memory like a funeral bell. But we have to be honest with the dead. The records do not let us count them cleanly. That number is powerful as an accusation, but not secure as arithmetic. The loss was real, enormous, and spread across places the ledgers barely touched. Mine, mill, road, hospital, village, womb, empty field. The truth is not smaller because the exact number escapes us. Sometimes horror is exactly what cannot be totaled. Think about that. A death in a tunnel could be seen. A sickness after mercury exposure might disappear into a household. A village losing its strongest workers might leave no neat corpse count, only abandoned fields, debt, hunger, and children growing into absence. The mountain did not need to kill everyone underground to change everything above ground. That is why the uncertainty matters. Cerro Rico generated so much wealth by spreading the cost so widely that no single book could hold the whole crime. And then the empire discovered a problem. One of the richest silver mountains the empire had ever seen was no longer giving easily. The old wind furnaces could not solve everything. Deeper ores were poorer, harder, and more stubborn. So the mountain's second life came through mercury. Ore was crushed into powder, mixed with salt, water, and mercury, and worked until the mercury captured silver like a cold metal spider catching light. The paste that remained could have been mostly mercury before the fire drove the poison away, leaving silver behind. But away does not mean gone. Away meant into the air, into the lungs, into the sky over Potosí. The silver came out shining, and the poison became almost invisible. This is one of the oldest tricks of extraction. Make the product beautiful, make the cost disappear. Capoce described the process with chilling calm, as if the chemistry were only a technical miracle. And it was a miracle in the most dangerous sense. Mercury allowed the empire to keep feeding after the easy feast was over. Mercury had its own mountain named Huancavelica, in what is now Peru. There, cinnabar was mined and smelted into quicksilver, much of it under forced labor too. So the machine tied one wound to another. Huancavelica fed poison to Potosí, and Potosí turned that poison into silver. Later estimates based on colonial records suggest that Potosí released approximately 39,000 metric tons of mercury vapor during the colonial refining era. In contrast, Huancavelica released around 17,000 more. The Silver River had a toxic breath. Now look at Potosí from above, not as a city, but as a creature. Dams and artificial lakes gathered water in the highlands. Channels and aqueducts led that water toward mills. Hydraulic machinery crushed and ground ore with violent force. Refineries turned powder into bars. The royal mint stamped metal into coins. Streets carried merchants, workers, animals, priests, gamblers, widows, guards, and debtors. In the 16th century, this place was remembered as the largest industrial complex of its age, not in Europe, here in the Andes. The water had two faces. It powered the mills and made the city possible, but it also carried what the mills left behind. Tailings, mercury residues, acidic drainage, and heavy metals moved downslope into streams and soils. The same reservoirs and channels that prove human genius also reveal human arrogance. Potosí's waterworks were brilliant, but brilliance becomes poison when its purpose is extraction without restraint. The water remembered what the treasury preferred to forget. The mountain did not keep its wounds politely underground. Inside the city, contradiction became architecture. Walk through colonial Potosí, and the argument is still there in stone. The royal mint, churches, patrician houses, carved facades, towers, plazas, saints, silver leaf, and beauty shaped by hands that rarely owned the wealth they made visible. Nearby were the worker neighborhoods, the barrios of drafted labor, the crowded margins where the mountain's human cost lived after the tunnel. One side glittered, the other side endured. They were not separate cities. They were the same sentence written in unequal ink. Observers called Potosí a Babylon, and the insult almost sounded like admiration. Food and animals came from far away, from Tucumán, Paraguay, Buenos Aires, and other regions pulled into the mountain's orbit. There was gambling, lawsuits, almsgiving, concubinage, charity, sickness, violence, devotion, indulgence, and hunger. Hospitals were filled with Spaniards and indigenous workers alike. Priests heard confessions, merchants counted profit, widows waited. The mountain stood above it all, red and silent, while the city below learned to live like a market built on a grave. And yet Potosí was never only horror. That would be too easy, and it would flatten the people who lived there. People formed friendships, raised children, made music, traded, worshipped, laughed, cheated owners, hid ore, negotiated wages, filed petitions, and invented small freedoms inside a brutal structure. Survival is not consent. Agency is not comfort. The people of Potosí were not props in Spain's tragedy. They were makers of life under conditions designed to reduce them to labor. The crown wanted every piece of silver to become visible. It took the royal fifth, nominally a 1/5 tax, along with fees, charges, mint profits, and all the little bites that turned metal into government. Capoch calculated that by June of 1585, more than 110.7 million assayed pesos had officially passed through taxation and assay since the early years of exploitation. And that was only what the state could see. Silver is a good servant of kings, but a better servant of smugglers. The official road ran like a spine. Cerro Rico to the Potosí treasury, Potosí to Arica, Arica to Lima, Lima to the fleets toward Panama, the Caribbean, Seville, and the hungry wars of the Spanish monarchy. Seville's House of Trade tried to turn the ocean, empire, paperwork, and silver into a single legible machine. But silver does not like cages. It leaked through borders, friendships, bribes, false weights, hidden bars, and roads that officials pretended not to see. Here is another turn. Potosí did not simply make Spain rich in a straight line. Much of the silver passed through Spain like rain across a roof, falling onward to creditors, bankers, merchants, soldiers, weapons, cloth, grain, and foreign debts. The empire needed silver because it was always spending, always fighting, always borrowing against the next shipment. Cerro Rico fed Spanish power, yes, but power was hungry too. An empire can be rich and bankrupt at the same time. Ask the coin. It remembers. Contraband was not a little side story whispered by a few dishonest men. It was part of the bloodstream. A significant share of colonial silver moved outside official channels, perhaps around 17 to 20% overall. From Potosí, unregistered metal slipped toward Buenos Aires and the River Plate, into Portuguese, Dutch, and wider Atlantic networks. The royal books were never the whole truth, only the truth wearing a uniform. The mountain produced silver. People produced pathways. Every law built a wall, and every wall taught someone where to dig. Now follow the coin farther. The Spanish-American piece of 8 became one of the first truly global currencies, trusted across oceans because enough strangers agreed to trust its weight. It paid soldiers in Europe, bought goods in Asia, settled debts, greased trade, and passed through hands that had never heard a word of Quechua or Aymara. A coin born from Andean pain could end its journey in a Chinese market, an Ottoman account, a Dutch ledger, or a pirate's chest. That is why Potosí matters beyond Bolivia, beyond Spain, beyond one empire. The mountain helped teach the world to think in silver. Prices, debts, wars, merchants, and empires adjusted around metal pulled from Andean stone. Some people call this early globalization, but that word can sound too clean, like a map in a textbook. In Potosí, globalization had coughing lungs. It had mercury vapor. It had women sorting ore. It had children on cold roads. It had a red mountain watching its own body become money. And then came the perfect symbol of a hollow empire. In 1649, the Great Potosí Mint fraud shook confidence in the coinage. Silver coins from the imperial machine were not as pure as they were supposed to be. Think about that for a second. The mountain had been hollowed. The workers had been hollowed out. The treasury had been fed by shortcuts, smuggling, coercion, and fraud. And then even the coin began to lie. The empire's cleanest symbols started confessing without words. Resistance did not always look like a sword raised in moonlight. Sometimes it looked like leaving before the census. Sometimes it looked like a community hiding people from draft lists. Sometimes it was paying silver instead of sending a body. Sometimes it was a petition written in the oppressor's language, but filled with Andean grief. Sometimes it was carried out in secret and sold through informal markets. The empire called this disorder. The people living inside the machine might have called it breathing. By the 18th century, two names began to matter: Cachas and trapicheros. The Cachas were workers who extracted ore from mines, often without the owner's permission, who claimed the mountain by law. The trapicheros were small refiners working in a popular silver economy that refused to stay neatly inside elite control. To mine owners, they looked like thieves. To many laboring people, they looked like survival with teeth. At times, this popular silver economy may have produced a remarkable share of Potosí silver. That is a dangerous detail for the old story, because it breaks the image of passive victims waiting under the empire. The people of Potosí were trapped, yes. Coerced, yes. Exploited, yes. But they also learned the machine's weak joints. They knew where ore moved, where officials looked away, where a small furnace could become a rebellion, where theft could become justice when ownership itself was born from violence. The mountain not only produced royal wealth, it produced counterworlds in the cracks. Writers tried to understand it while the dust was still fresh. Capoche gave the administrative eye: quotas, processes, taxes, furnaces, roads. Bartolomé Arzan's writing later gave the city's memory: warnings, miracles, punishments, marvels, scandals, and the moral smoke rising from the mountain. Antonio Vázquez de Espinosa saw a vast urban beast fed by distant regions. Indigenous voices like Felipe Guaman Poma turned colonial greed into accusation. Each source looked at a different Potosí: fiscal, legendary, urban, wounded, toxic, sacred. And that is why the story must be told carefully. Popular culture loves the curse because it's cinematic. A mountain that speaks, a hidden treasure, a prophecy for other owners, a red cone that eats men. It sounds like folklore because reality was theatrical enough to shame fiction. But if we say the mountain itself was evil, we let the systems that organized the hunger disappear. The mountain did not write quotas. The mountain did not tax the silver. The mountain did not ship mercury across the Andes. The real villain is the appetite wearing the law as a mask, the appetite of empire, the appetite of markets that want coins without widows, cathedrals without forced hands, global trade without poisoned streams, beautiful objects without ugly origins. Cerro Rico became monstrous because power discovered it could hide human cost inside distance. A coin in Europe did not look like a coin in Bolivia. A purchase in Asia did not smell like mercury in Potosí. Distance made the crime elegant. Decline came slowly because hungry machines do not die the first time they choke. Silver production remained important, but ore quality worsened. Costs rose, flooding spread through lower workings, and fraud multiplied. By the time of independence in the early 19th century, many shafts had been abandoned or flooded, and Potosí's population had collapsed from its great colonial height to a much smaller city. The Spanish crown was gone, but the mountain was not free. New republics inherit old holes, and old holes know how to remain useful. Later came revival, then another metal, another promise. Cheaper mercury helped silver return for a time. Then the tin rose. The mountain changed its appetite, and the world changed its prices. In 1952, the Bolivian Revolution nationalized much of the mining sector and gave miners a powerful political role. For a while, the people of the tunnels stood near the center of national history, not as shadows, but as actors. But in 1985, the tin collapse broke that world, and thousands were pushed into precarious new arrangements. Today, Cerro Rico is still mined, though the old silver glory has mostly given way to tin, zinc, lead, and remaining silver. Many miners work through cooperatives, often in dangerous old shafts where independence and abandonment can look almost the same. The mountain is also a destination for visitors who enter tunnels with cameras, gifts, nervous laughter, and a guide's warning. Imagine being asked to perform your wound for strangers because that wound is still how your family eats. That is not history ending, that is history charging admission. Child labor and informal work have repeatedly drawn international concern, and the phrase alone should make the tunnel feel smaller. But even here, the story deserves care. This is not a tale about poor families failing to understand danger. It is about poverty compressing choice until a mine can look like survival. The colonial mita is not legally in force in its original form, but the pressure remains recognizable: a mountain, a market, a family, and a risk someone else will call voluntary. And then, after centuries of extraction, the mountain itself began to collapse. Tunnels had carved Cerro Rico from within like termites inside a saint's statue. Sinkholes opened near the summit. Engineers, miners, preservationists, and residents argued over how to keep the cone from falling apart while people still depended on it. In 2014, the United Nations Cultural Agency placed Potosí on the World Heritage in Danger list because uncontrolled mining threatened the site. In 2025, warnings still remained because preservation was delayed. This is the cruelest contradiction. Preserve the mountain, and you threaten livelihoods. Keep mining it, and you threaten the mountain, the city's heritage, and the people inside the tunnels. There is no clean, heroic angle here. No easy villain you can defeat in the last scene. The colonial machine built a dependency so deep that even memory is trapped inside it. Cerro Rico is heritage, yes, but it is also rent, debt, breakfast, school fees, funeral money, and risk. The land keeps receipts. Around Potosí, centuries of mining left deforestation, soil loss, acidic drainage, heavy metals in streams, and contamination feeding the Pilcomayo Basin. Those words can sound flat until you imagine water itself becoming a witness, carrying the broken chemistry of extraction downstream. A mine does not end at the tunnel mouth. It travels in dust, in riverbeds, in bodies, in family stories, in economies, in the taste of land that has been asked to swallow too much. So what is Cerro Rico now? A sacred Andean mountain, a colonial slaughterhouse, an urban marvel, a monetary engine, a toxic archive, a collapsing monument, a workplace, a tourist attraction, a grave without a number large enough to hold it. Maybe it is all of these at once. Maybe that is why the mountain still unsettles us. It refuses to become one symbol. It keeps changing shape depending on who is looking, who is counting, who is praying, and who is digging. Remember the coin again. Cold, bright, almost innocent. On one side, empire. On the other hand, a mark of trust. But the real design is invisible. A woman sorting ore, an indigenous worker coughing in the dark, an Afro-descended worker in the mint, a child walking a high road, a merchant smiling in Seville, a creditor waiting in Europe, a buyer in Asia testing the silver's weight. The coin is not an object. It is a compressed chain of breath, debt, poison, and power. And this is why Cerro Rico still matters. Not because we need another sad story from colonial Latin America to place on a shelf. It matters because the pattern did not die. Somewhere, right now, another landscape is being told it is only valuable once broken open. Another community is being told that sacrifice is necessary for progress. Another consumer is holding a clean object whose dirty history has been polished away. Potosí is not a closed chapter. It is an old mirror, and it still knows our faces. At the beginning, we asked how one mountain could feed an empire while swallowing generations. Now the answer is clearer and darker. It was not silver alone. It was law, hunger, racism, technology, water, mercury, debt, courage, smuggling, prayer, and memory. It was the power to turn a sacred Andean place into a machine and then call the machine civilization. It was also the refusal of the people inside that machine to vanish completely. They left petitions, tunnels, coins, songs, buildings, stories, and descendants. The mountain remains, damaged, mined, watched, prayed to, photographed, feared. The city remains too, beautiful and wounded, with the old royal mint standing like a stone confession. Somewhere in the world, coins from Potosí still sit behind glass, quiet as bones. They look small now, almost harmless, but hold one in your imagination and it grows heavy, not because silver is heavy, because history is. Maybe that old warning was not meant only for the Incas or the Spaniards or the miners of one century. Maybe it was meant for anyone who sees a mountain and asks only what can be taken from it. Do not take the silver, the voice said, because it belongs to other owners. After 5 centuries, we are still arguing about who those owners were. Kings, companies, workers, ancestors, the earth itself. So tell me, is Cerro Rico a monument, a crime scene, a living ancestor, or all of them at once? Thank you immensely. I appreciate you for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.